Welcome to Writing and Fighting. This is April 21st, and we have a great class today. I am so excited. We have Dan Stupp, who has, I'm going to go into his background. He is the current editor of The Athletic, and he was so kind to come to the AU MMA Media Symposium back in December. Dan, that seems like 3 years ago.
It does.
I'm so happy. And then later we're going to talk with Mike Pendelton. Mike, here you are, New York City. I see on your hoodie.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk more about his time in media, and you know, he's doing 2 podcasts at the moment. And so I'm going to introduce you later. But first, Dan, you are the former founder of MMA Junkie, and you graduated from University of Missouri Journalism School, and later worked for the creative services manager for the Cincinnati Reds. And I really love this. I'm a Nationals fan, but I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. So you had to make the choice.
Yep.
Are you a Brown, Cleveland Brown, or a Cincinnati Red?
On the Southern teams, the Bengals and the Reds.
Yes. So I went south, you know, so I am kind of a Red, but I'm a National now. And then before devoting himself full-time to MMA, Dan co-founded MMA Junkie, an online website, in 2006, and later sold the publication to USA Today, where he continued as editor-in-chief until 2018, when he joined The Athletic as the editor of Mixed Martial Arts. It's a subscription sports publication that features stories from numerous top professional and college sports, including the NFL, NBA, MLB, boxing, and MMA. Oh, it's so sad to talk about major sports. They will be back. But thank you, Dan, so much for joining us. I've been kind of telling my guests when they come on here our story, our COVID story, I guess, because I'd like to know kind of like how you're doing, because you're in Virginia, Lexington, Virginia?
Yeah.
That's right. What part of Virginia is that?
We moved here a little less than a year ago. I probably should know that, but I think it's kind of western southern.
Western southern. So. Got it. So, I mean, we're neighbors up here, and Northern Virginia, you know, is part of the DMV with DC and Maryland. So our class started January 14th. And I've told people this was going to be an amazing semester. We had Tyson versus Wilder end of February, and then we had Ferguson and Khabib, which would have been last weekend. Dan, Google for reminding me. I woke up on Saturday. So we were told March 9th they were in their spring break, that our semester would be online, or I think it was maybe 3 weeks, but then they extended it to the semester. And so we've been remote, doing virtual since March 20th. And just looking at, you know, DC, where we just had a few cases back then in March. We are now, I think there's 2,793. You know, we're a city of 600,000, and we've had 96 deaths. And then looking at Virginia, this is the state, you guys just had not even just a couple cases early March as well, and you're now to 8,537 and 277 deaths. So as I was saying, December seems years ago. That was only a month ago, that, you know, or a month and a half ago now. So at first I want to ask you how you're doing, and then I want to get into some questions because of what's happened in the sports landscape. Also, UFC, I mean, it's given me something to watch. What, you know, will there be a Fight Island? Will there be this May 9th card? And we're kind of learning the strain has also been on this press promotion fighter relationship. So, but first, tell us how you're doing.
I'm doing well. I'm actually here at my wife's optometry office. We took this over about a year ago. She's the actual optometrist. I help out where I can, but we had to, we can only see emergency patients, and had to furlough the staff. So I come in when she has emergency patients. So I'm kind of, we're seeing people daily, which is kind of scary. We take all the safety precautions we can, but
Mm.
thankfully our county's been pretty quiet. Just a few cases, I think, probably to their own detriment. People around here just don't take it very seriously, or they go to the stores, no face masks, no gloves, just kind of talking and hanging out. So you can see kind of how it could possibly get bad. But I don't know. It's kind of good that life does seem somewhat normal around here, other than, just take out food and things like that. But I walk my dog on the golf course every morning. So it's nice to still get outside and stuff. So other than that, things are don't seem too crazy.
That's great. So you've been there a year. One thing with MMA, when you started in 2006, where were you living then?
Cincinnati. I was still working for the Reds. Kind of that first year, I had started the website and was trying to do both jobs well, and kind of did two jobs half-assed. But but it kept me a salary and insurance while I was trying to get the website off the ground. So it worked out well.
Yeah. Um, so then I actually going to start with you. Sometimes I'm going right with what's going on in the moment. I am so curious because you've like been in MMA so long. This is a new sport. I mean, 1993, we kind of think of the time when UFC 1 happened, but you could even predate it then. Um, you were a baseball, you were working for the Reds. What led you into the MMA?
It was a few different things. Kind of in college, like I had done internships and tried kind of the different sections of the paper: metro, business, religion, lifestyle, entertainment, and really hadn't found kind of the beat that I wanted to settle on, and kept coming back to how much I like baseball and sports. I wasn't a huge sports guy, but I was a big Cincinnati Reds fan. And I kind of realized, with the publications and the website and the newsletter, there may be an opportunity to work for the Reds. So I kind of shifted my career there. It worked out well. It was great working there, but I had kind of gotten out of journalism by doing that. You're kind of doing more PR. And Grant, we did some really cool publications, Cincinnati Reds magazine and newsletters, where I felt like I was kind of doing journalism, but definitely had one foot out the door and wouldn't be taken seriously as a journalist. Um, so I knew I kind of wanted to find a way to get back into it. I didn't think baseball was the way to do it, since no one would kind of take you seriously as a PR guy trying to, also cover the sport. And thankfully at that time, MMA was really starting to take off. The Ultimate Fighter in 2005 really kind of put the sport on the map. So, I kind of saw an opportunity there. There weren't a lot of websites covering the sport. You could tell the sport was going to get really, really big. And part of it was just, completely selfish, self-serving uh, things, where I could tell there'd be job opportunities in this sport, an opportunity to make some money if everything worked out well. So I don't know. I think more than anything, I just kind of saw an opportunity with a new sport, and people weren't covering it really well. There weren't a whole lot of people, serious journalists covering the sport. So kind of just the journalists and me saw an opportunity there.
Yeah. Did you have a love for combat sports, whether it's boxing or?
It was newer. Like I remember growing up and watching some boxing on HBO, and they had some K1 kickboxing on ESPN at 2 a.m. That it just blew my mind that they were allowed to put that on TV. Guys getting knocked out and stuff. But you started to kind of or appreciate the beauty of it. I never was really kind of anti-fighting or anti-combat sports, but I was just never really kind of into it to a real extent. But it worked out well. Right when the UFC and MMA was really taking off, Rich Franklin, the middleweight champion for a while, he was from near Cincinnati. We brought him out to a Cincinnati Reds game to throw out a first pitch. I kind of stayed friendly with him, and as I started the website, we had a lot of Rich Franklin coverage, because he was kind of the only source or only person I knew. But that kind of led into other ones. So it just, kind of some serendipity, kind of how it all kind of fell into place for me.
Yeah. So can you tell me about MMA Junkie and how that got?
Yeah, it's funny. I thought at the time, I was like, this is something I can do in my spare time. if I could make a little extra money, great. If people are actually reading it, where I can kind of establish myself kind of as a journalist again or as an editor again, kind of doing real news, that would be a benefit. But it's just the timing was so weird. I think within the first week of starting the website, we were doing 2 or 3,000 hits within 6 or 7 days. And it was kind of perfect timing. UFC 69 with George St. Pierre was coming up. The Ultimate Fighter was really doing some nice ratings on Spike TV. So it just kind of, again, just everything fell into place. And doing MMA Junkie, I'd never really kind of had the opportunity to step back and wonder if I wanted to do it, because it just took off so quickly that it was nice. There probably would have been a lot of doubts about whether this is worth the time and the effort, but when you get that immediate feedback that people are reading, and fighters and managers are reaching out to do interviews, it kind of made the decision for me.
Yeah. And back then, so you were getting ad revenue.
Yeah. Well, actually, probably the first year and a half, we did no advertising at all. We thought
Really?
a really good way to kind of earn the trust of people, or for them not to think that we were jumping in it solely for money, even though I kind of was. Um, but it just made it very clean. I think we stood out because people realized if you just want the news, you want it delivered kind of in an impartial, non-biased way. A lot of people were writing about MMA, but you could tell they were kind of fans writing about it. And I took a very kind of neutral stand. So the fact that you could get just the news and there was no clutter from the advertising or anything, I think that really did kind of help establish ourselves really quick.
Now, would you go on media scrums, or were you staying in Cincinnati?
It was weird. Probably I didn't travel. I think it was probably about a year and a half before I traveled. The UFC actually wouldn't credential us, even the first 4 or 5 years of the website. But I started doing a weekly MMA column for the Dayton Daily News in Ohio. I had interned there through college. The sports editor was like, "Hey, MMA is really taking off. I know we've got some local fighters. What do you think about doing a weekly column?" So it wasn't a huge time commitment or anything, but the UFC would then credential me through the newspaper. So I was kind of double dipping. But so yeah, the first show I ever did, big shocker, was Strike Force at the Playboy Mansion. I decided it was an event I absolutely had to cover for journalistic purposes. But no, so I flew out to Beverly Hills. I was sitting we were kind of on press row, but all night I was sitting next to Jamie Presley and the guy who played Randy from My Name is Earl.
Oh my
Ethan
God.
Suplee.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it was just a surreal night in that sense. Like, the Playboy Bunnies, and Hugh is there, and seeing the celebrities. So you come home from something like that and you realize, I probably should travel a lot more. This is
Yeah, yeah.
this is very fascinating.
That was so Strike Force. Yeah, who was the headline? That was an actual fight, you guys, at
I can't remember who the headliner was, but like George Masvidal was a young George
yeah.
Masvidal on the card. Bobby Southworth from the first season of the UFC, Joe Riggs, who's been around forever.
Mhm.
And I think I don't think Frank Shamrock fought. I think he was doing broadcasting. Frank Trigg was there cornering some guys. So yeah, looking back, it's funny what it seemed like. It could have just been kind of a novelty card where Strikeforce didn't bring out the best talent. It was more about just saying you did a show at the Playboy Mansion. But looking back, or Josh Thompson was on the card too. It was a surprisingly deep card. So.
Yeah, I know. So you're gaining, you got the legitimacy, the fact that you guys didn't take ad revenue. Then you start getting ad revenue and it starts getting more hits, it sounds like, and you're getting and
Yeah, kind of the first year we signed a content partnership with Yahoo Sports, which especially back then was, it was basically ESPN and Yahoo Sports. So that was one of the biggest ones you could get. So that opened a lot of doors. It gave us a little more money to travel to more shows, to hire some freelancers and stuff. So it just kind of the life of the website. It just kind of started as a one-man operation where I had a guy that, I knew from a poker game in Cincinnati. He was kind of handling marketing and advertising, and then a guy that we knew through similar poker friends who lived in Kansas City and kind of knew how to build websites and the technology aspect of it. Just kind of everything just kept falling into place. And like I said, we quickly built that momentum. So, at that point, it was kind of like, it was making the decisions for us.
Yeah. And at that time, major publications, were they having features on MMA? Because we're going to get to the point where USA Today comes to you.
Yeah. It was just started. Yahoo Sports realized kind of what I did a few months earlier, that the sport was taking off. Kind of whoever got to it first could establish a foothold. And I think you had Kevin Iole on or in the class recently, and they had I think, I can't remember if he was already hired for boxing or he also started doing some MMA too. For Yahoo, he had worked for the Las Vegas paper. So just, I think from probably the end of 2005 to the end of 2006 was just kind of when NBC Sports, Yahoo Sports, ESPN a bit, kind of everybody started jumping into the sport. But the first few years was still kind of, you had to be an advocate for MMA, explain why it wasn't as bad as people thought it was. Like, I remember doing some national news shows where they just needed someone to come on and explain why this wasn't human cockfighting or why it should even be legal.
Yeah.
So I know one of the questions was kind of talking about the relationship with promoters and specifically the UFC. And I think a reason that probably the UFC specifically gets so kind of upset with the UFC or just upset with, journalists doing their jobs is, at least in those first few years, it felt like everybody was kind of on the same team, promoting MMA to the masses, making them realize whatever you saw in the past, now we have rules, we have weight classes.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you officially were on the same team or not, at least it felt like everybody was in it together. But, over time, you're going to start to figure out what the warts of the sport are, the issues, health and pay and all that stuff eventually comes up. But for those first few years, it seems very blissful that everybody's on the same page, kind of working together. And then you really have to start doing the next phase of your job, and that doesn't make you a lot of friends.
Yeah, no, that is interesting to give an, that view that Dana White, you guys were in his corner, to use a boxing idiom, and now it's, you're saying, as you said, you're doing your job, which is to report not only facts, but give them context. And that's, what we're going to do. So, so also, I just think it's so interesting that you said you started this, yourself, you had your friend who was a poker game friend. And then you get in 2011, you sell this to USA Today and you remain as the editor.
Yeah, we had kind of gotten to the point with, his name was Tom Cummins and Eric Foster, the two guys I kind of started it with. It was always kind of a part-time thing for them. They had full-time jobs, kind of like I did initially, but we realized we got kind of as big as we were going to get with our limited resources. And if we wanted to get to the next step, we had to sell to somebody. We hired a company that kind of worked as our representatives as we were trying to sell. And it was kind of a really good time for it because MMA, just through online advertising, well, not just MMA, the entire sports world was, there was a lot of money going around at that time. It was kind of the second .com boom. It was really focused on content and sports at the time. So we had talked to a lot of people, they had talked to some promotions themselves, like the UFC or Strikeforce buying the company, which as a journalist, I wouldn't have been a big fan of. It would have gone right back into the situation with the Reds where it's like, yeah, I'm covering the sport, but I'm not really a journalist. But, we had talked to Mark Cuban and HDNet, which is now Access TV. They were doing some of their own MMA promotions. Spike TV, one of the broadcast partners. We had talked to ESPN, Yahoo, everybody like that. But USA Today was really kind of taking their first big steps from a newspaper to this whole creation of USA Today Sports. A whole division within USA Today. So the timing worked out really well. But again, it was just really good timing because I think everyone, that was 5 years after the Ultimate Fighter and the sport really started taking off. And that was really kind of the growth period where they realized, this may not be a super niche sport. This may be something that can get big, TV rights fees on. They were on Spike TV at the time, but there was talk about, Fox and ESPN even back then. So again, it was really great timing. I think if we had to try to do that today, not just with the coronavirus issues kind of plaguing the businesses, but we've seen kind of journalism jobs dry up and go away. So uh, for us to sell when we did, 2011 was probably the perfect year for it.
No, and I have to, object that it's not just timing, Dan. You're very talented, and I think you understand this, the mechanism of media with MMA, and you were able to be ahead there, which also you were ahead in terms of when the Athletic came, and this is after the 2016 sell of UFC to Endeavor, and now it was on ESPN. And my students have been loving the Athletic. So we appreciate that, the long form content. I mean, it's right for my class. But can you tell us about your move into that organization?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy. Things weren't going super well with USA Today, and it kind of came to a head in um, 2018. We just had very different kind of visions for the website, and what I envisioned was much more like the Athletic, and I think they were much more focused on ad revenue and kind of the things like that. So I actually left there, and I had interviewed for a few other jobs outside of MMA, kind of some sports betting stuff, which I feel is kind of like where MMA was back in 2006, really starting to take off, people trying to figure out exactly what the media was. But that kind of wasn't working out, and I wasn't real happy kind of with what was out there. So my wife and I decided to buy this optometry practice, which I was supposed to help run. And literally the day after we signed papers to run the optometry office, the Athletic called and asked if I'd be interested in running their MMA division. So that was a real fun talk with my wife, who I'd been married to for less than a year, telling her, hey, that company we just bought, like, what do you think if I also do this other job?
That's the way it goes.
Yeah, but it, like, again, the timing worked out really well. I had some time to kill, about 3 or 4 months before we moved here to Virginia. I was living in Tennessee at the time, a town of 600 people. It was on this real beautiful lake, tons of hiking. Like, that's why I live there. But obviously, there's not a big booming news industry in a town of 600 or a county of 2,000. But the local paper asked. They said, "Look, we may be insulting you by even asking this, but would you want to cover our spring sports? We can pay you $12 an hour, and it's a lot of travel, and you need to use your own car." But I thought it might be fun, just to kind of get back to writing, especially with MMA Junkie. I've been doing so much editing and strategizing, not really actually kind of, getting boots on the ground or anything, but uh, just covering middle school and high school sports, and going to games where 50 people were in the stands, and, interviewing them like I would any fighter afterward. It was fun to do that. It kind of re-sparked my passion for journalism, and I kind of realized, like, maybe I don't want to get out of this completely. And then, the Athletic called about a week after my final track meet that I covered.
You're right on
Um,
that.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, it again, it worked out so well, and um, even running MMA Junkie, the concept of working for a company like the Athletic, it just, there wasn't anything like that to even aspire to get to that point. That used to be magazines and maybe big newspapers, but even they were scaling back. And an editor was also a writer, and also a social media manager and a photographer, and you didn't have really specialized editor jobs. They were drying up and stuff. So yeah, I mean, the perfect job kind of came along, and I didn't even know it really existed. So.
Got it. Hey, so real quick, are any of those track meet articles online?
I don't even think the newspaper was online. I still have the actual clippings
You have
of
the
those stories. I had to go to the news station. It was a weekly newspaper, and I had to go each Tuesday morning up to the Triple D, our gas station, and
wow.
put my quarter in the machine and get a newspaper. So that's how I started back in middle school.
That's great. But I want to tell people like it's the process, right?
Yeah.
And he had just, had launched MMA Junkie, had worked with, when it moved over, and kind of had the USA Today. And then you go back and you said you kind of remembered why you love journalism and covering sports. So no job is too small, I guess is the other thing with that.
If you can interview a 14-year-old girl about running the 400 meters, against two other country schools with a track meet of 10 people each, where they can't even run most events, but like you learn how to interview people who are just used to yes no or no sir yes sir, country kids who grew up with manners and stuff. But if you can pull out some insightful stuff out of them,
Yeah.
you get a little, especially working in baseball, less so MMA because they're not as polished. But, for the most part, those athletes know how to do interviews. They know what you're looking for. They give you the answers you expect. But, talking to 13 and 14-year-old kids who have never been interviewed before, if you can pull something worthwhile out of that. I mean, you're going to have to work for it, but it makes it that much more satisfying.
Exactly. Build that backstory and storyline. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you are offered to be editor at the Athletic, did you get to build your own team, or were they kind of crafting? Did you know who you're going to work with?
They told me to put together, they said, pretend like money and, affiliations and job contracts, pretend that's not an option and put together your dream team.
Wow.
Uh, Spend the evening thinking about it, and then we'll circle back tomorrow. They had their list, and I had my list, and I think there was only one name difference out of like the 6 people on the list. So thankfully, I got my list, but they pretty much already had it in the
I
works
already had it.
anyway. So
Well, we're fans of yourself and many of your writers. I was just talking to Atticus, who's a big Sean Al-Shadi fan, and Chuck Mindenhall. We read many of his pieces, both of them. So will you report back? And then Fernanda, am I saying her last name right?
I think it's Prochus,
Prachi.
but she says it with a Portuguese accent, so
Yeah.
I never really fully understand.
And then Ben Folks. I
Yeah.
mean, we're fans of everyone, so please report back that
Yeah.
a lot of my syllabus. Thank you for helping fill it up. Uh, well, wow, it's so exciting. And I want to get into some of the current news, but how about go from this? Is that I think I told you I emailed you a couple of weeks and asked how you were going, and you wrote back. It's a lockdown of every sport, but you said, but it's really forced the writers to get creative. So it's been a rewarding challenge in that way. So I'm asking you what innovative articles could you have never imagined writing? And then is it getting easier, more challenging? What's it like to write about sports without sports?
Well, I think the good thing in MMA is that our sport is so, for lack of a better term, stupid sometimes that like we're the only ones still trying to put on events, and almost every day there's a development there. And we don't do a whole lot of straight news, but I think we have to put kind of each of these developments as they're trying to put on events or buy or create Fight Island and fighting, trying to put events on tribal land in California and things like that. So um, we still kind of have the news and column aspect of it. But we had a couple of big projects, specifically within the MMA section, that we were kind of in the middle of doing or getting ready to do, and we weren't sure we were going to have the time to do them. And thankfully, the break in the event schedule really kind of opened this up. Last week, we did the MMA fan survey, where we kind of surveyed all of our, as many subscribers as we could. And two things, like we knew we'd get some really cool content out of it. And I think we did, kind of pay-per-view buying habits, how many people actually just kind of steal the events and still, and how many think fighters aren't paid enough, and how they're treated by the organizations. We thought it would be, fairly lopsided, not kind of as lopsided as we did, but there was a lot of other really cool stuff we got out of that. But kind of an extension of that is we're in the process right now. I don't think anyone's really ever done this, but we're interviewing 200 fighters from across the globe. Everyone from Bellator and UFC to the smaller organizations. It's about a half-hour process for each one. I mean, we're asking everything from health and fighter pay to unionization, just the fight night experience. Like, a third of them have said they have thrown up right before a fight from nerves. And so we're getting a lot of really cool stuff. And we haven't really put it out there, and we still have a lot more surveys to go. But like, we've already found some really cool stuff. Like 2/3 of the fighters we've talked to said that they've taken a fight and they fought when they were injured and knew that they shouldn't, solely because they needed the money, which, we know fighters kind of have that mentality, and they'll fight at all costs. But we think maybe when push comes to shove, they're not actually as tough as they say they are. But it's like, no, they definitely are. And about brain damage, they think, by the time their career's over, they're going to have effects of brain damage. A third of them said they're already experiencing the effects of CTE and brain damage. So the fact that they're kind of doing this very rigorous and demanding sport for little pay, knowing that they're putting their health, that they've already sacrificed some of their health. That's a big time undertaking to kind of gather all this information and get the fighters, or getting our writers spending, weeks doing these interviews and stuff. So thankfully, kind of with the downtime, we're trying to put it to good use and do stuff that kind of no one's done before. So that'll be a really big project that we have out soon.
Well, Dan, I'm already telling you that my students, it won't be ready probably. They're writing their final research papers now. But we talk about you need to support with evidence, and that sounds like amazing quantitative information, because a lot of times with MMA you just have the anecdotes, the qualitative. Yeah. And are you also going to have some of those? Are you getting different stories and stuff like that, or is it more quantitative?
Yeah, the first half of it's very quantitative. The weight class they're in, their average walking around weight, what they actually weigh on fight night. Like, I think we can carve that up by division and get some meaningful data. But the whole second half of the survey, it's everything from, your personal favorite fighter to the biggest jerk you've met in MMA, to your plans after fighting, your personal favorite commentator, who's the worst referee, and hearing some of the stories behind them. So I think it's really fun to get all this data, but we're going to have to spend the entire month of May trying to make sense of all this really useful stuff we got.
No, and I'm telling you that this would be great for a lot of your papers to have this data. So be looking out for that, and I will definitely be looking out for that. Well, here, I would like to bring Mike into the conversation here, because I want to introduce him and talk real quickly about your journey, because it's like, Dan, you're 2006 MMA junkie. We got Mike here, who's only been in MMA since 5 years, you said?
Yeah. Yep.
Oh my gosh. Well, here, let me.
Complete opposite of Dan. Complete opposite of Dan.
So we got two ends of the spectrum, but the best ends. All right. So Mike Pendelton is joining us from Jersey. And I'll get into Jersey in terms of COVID, because, we really got to be thinking about you guys. And we have some students, just to let you know, we have students from Jersey, we have students from Pennsylvania, Oregon, South Africa, Texas. I'm trying to think of other places, DC, Maryland. We're all over, California. Yeah. But so you are a writer for Fansided MMA, a radio host and producer at ChicagolandSportsRadio.com and 87.7 FM, The Game Chicago. He currently works for MMA on Sirius XM Radio, BJPenn.com, My MMA News, the Scrap News, The Hub Chicago. He is also a host for both On the Mic podcast and Inside the Cage.
Yeah.
Do you have enough?
Yeah, it's a lot. It's freelancing. I mean, all this stuff, like the Fansided stuff, I was with them a long time ago. Then when I started to go into MMA, I went back to them. And then like it's a crazy gym. My actual first start is somewhat similar to Dan's, except not with MMA. I started my own high school football recruiting website, and I was going around like Chicago and the Chicagoland suburbs, and I was in high school, like covering other high school athletes, trying to get them to college.
Wow.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone will remember, like I think it was called Ustream or something, but it was like a video like streaming service. Athletes would use it all the time. Like I've been on Twitter since almost day one. That used to be how I would get my interviews. But I think into like something Dan was talking about earlier, if interviewing 14-year-old track athletes, I was interviewing 16-year-old high school football players who had no idea that anyone cared about what they were doing. And, you know, I'd be like, hey, like almost managing them at the same time. Like that social media post, yeah, it's probably not a good post. You want me to, you know, I would even have a video editor help put together like highlight films for them and all that. And I started getting contacted by like schools, like, hey, do you have information on that? I'm like, what is going on? So I got away from that because I got an ugly phone call one day from someone who was trying to push certain players to certain schools. And he was trying to help me, and he had promised me all these things, such as the world of journalism. You're promised a lot and rarely receive what you're promised. And I was like, he was like, listen, you don't understand. I will bury you. You won't get any recruits. And I was like, dude, I'm like 18. I'm good. So after that, like I just went into sports radio, and I got super lucky after that.
Got it. Yeah. So sports radio, not MMA.
Yeah. So it's real funny. So I started doing a lot of I dropped the ball here because I would have video proof of it, but I didn't. When I attended outside of Chicago, I attended Rolling Meadows High School. At the same time I was there thinking I was the big shot, some guy named Jimmy Garoppolo, who just played in the Super Bowl, was also at our school. And I had been friends with every player on the football team, but I was only bringing my grade. He was a senior, I was a junior. I was only bringing my grade of football players into my home and having them do this video stuff. And I would interview them, and everyone's like, you got to get Jimmy. You got to get Jimmy. And I was like, I can get to him later. And dropped the ball on that one. But what I started doing is I got hurt playing basketball. And actually someone who I had been playing fantasy sports with was like, you love to argue. You should write for this company called Bleacher Report. And if you go on Bleacher Report now, search my name, I still have a bunch of articles that are poorly written. I don't think their editing was what it is now. But I've kind of been there since, as Dan was there, from kind of the newspaper and transitioning into this online journalism world that we're now in. Like I was there for the start of it. You know, if you look back at some of the stuff I wrote for Bleacher Report and presented them with that idea now, they're like, no, we're good. You know, like slideshows were a big thing. Now it's all this stuff. It's video conferences. It's, you know, social media. So it's totally different now.
Yeah. No. And, you know, obviously video content and podcasts. But I'm so curious, you know, with your journey, how did you, because again, you've only been in this for 5 years. How did you have that learning curve of learning, you know, all the fighters and getting involved? Because it seems sometimes overwhelming.
So yeah, it absolutely is. So here's the backstory on that quickly. I had been working for 87.7 The Game in Chicago. I was working with like someone I grew up, when the Bears went to the Super Bowl in 2006, they had a fullback named Jason McKee. I always liked him because his number was 37, and he was just an anomaly. Like no one liked fullbacks. I did. Well, as I started going to college, I left college, went to the Illinois Center for Broadcasting. There I got into their sports program. And since I had all this online internet knowledge, and I had guests that I've interviewed just by hustling on social media, they said, hey, we wanted to go cover this event for the Jason McKee Foundation. So I met Jason finally. We clicked right away. And then on my 22nd birthday, he called me and was like, hey, I know I was supposed to help you get an internship. I dropped the ball. I want to get you a real job. Come be my producer at 87.7. So that station lasted for about a year. I was not fully employed there for a year. I know they hate when I admit it, but it's the truth. I had to guerrilla my way in there. So when the station went down, I had some contacts in Philly who were like, hey, just come to the Fanatic. Like, we'll put in a good word for you. So I just picked up and moved. Told my mom, like, yeah, I don't know what's going to happen, but I got somewhere to live. I'm going. And like, I had really good friends. They're still great friends of mine. Let me stay there. And I never heard back from the Fanatic. After they told me to move there, they were like, we'll give you time. And I was like, all right, how's a month? Because I met with them in February. I was like, I can move here in March. Like, it's great. It wasn't great. They never answered any calls, emails, nothing. They fired the people that I was supposed to work with. So after 2 months of sitting around, I was like, all right, I'm moving back. And I'll never forget, it was a random, I want to say Tuesday night. I think I told you this story. I'm packing up my stuff, and I'd always heard about boxing and MMA, and I watched Floyd Mayweather fights, but I was always more appealed to the loudmouth showboating NFL players, NBA players. And I saw this UFC fight on. It was Conor McGregor versus Dennis Seaver. And I was like, look, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm packing. I might as well just put it on. There's nothing else to watch. McGregor beats Seaver, as most of you may know, jumps the cage afterwards and starts screaming at Jose Aldo. And I like dropped everything in my tracks. And I was like, I don't know. I don't know who that is, but I'm in. So I contacted my friends. They're like, yeah, dude, this guy fights on Saturday. And that was UFC 189 when he fought Chad Mendez. And you would have thought I was a lifelong fan of that Buffalo Wild Wings. I was telling everyone to shut up. I was like, you guys got to be quiet. This fight is going on. So that was the first live event I watched. And to answer your question now, I just committed to it. You know, as I was going over some of the questions you sent, you know, my biggest advice, like, into kind of making up for lost time is treat covering the sport the way you would be if you were who you're covering. Meaning, when you talk to fighters, hey man, I got to go to the gym later today. I was just at the gym this morning. We can fit it in between 2 and 4. And then I got night classes I teach. Like, fighters are at the gym almost 7 days a week, multiple times a day, the ones who are truly dedicated to this. So for me, I was like, I'm watching everything. I'm watching all fights, all documentaries. I'm watching old fights. Who are my favorite fighters? Who am I drawn to? And I just went crazy on that. So that's how I kind of made up for lost time. And then there's a whole other about media side and how I got into how I wanted to cover this sport and how I dedicated time to that.
Amazing. My daughter just needed something. I'm listening.
No, you're fine.
You need a pencil? Here.
That's not what I'm looking for.
Okay. Well, I got to get back to this. I apologize.
Just ignore me.
I will. So no, Mike, well, no, it's so interesting about, you know, treat the people, like, know that they're at the gym, acknowledge that, have all this information. And I'd like to bring Dan back into the conversation about what's going on now in sports. And I think I mentioned before, it's given me, can you do that, please? Just take it with you. Oh my.
Did you just lose? Did I just break your computer?
No. All right. I love this time. This is great. My thought was, about, you know, because we had the whole Tochi Palace. We were still going to do April 18th. And then, you know, it kind of looked like things were shut down. Now we have May 9th, which is an amazing card. You know, I kind of look at it and it's kind of like, you know, you hope something. I look at it, but I'm like, that's too good to be true. It's like an oasis. I'm literally in the desert. I'm that desperate to watch a fight again. What are your thoughts? I'll ask Dan and then Mike on this May 9th card. Will it happen?
I think we really don't know. Just in part of that, the situation's so fluid, which, you know, what seemed like a good idea maybe a month ago now seemed like it would be a terrible idea. And it feels like it's kind of that way week to week, and you don't know what forces are kind of working against them. So, you know, I don't even want to say I'm optimistic, because I still don't think it's a really smart thing to do. You know, I don't think they're going to take the safety precautions that they need to at all. But I, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if they somehow pull it off, but I also wouldn't be surprised if they pull it off, realize all the mistakes that they made and the things that they should have done differently. And then it's another month or two before we actually get another event after that.
Yes. Mike, I'm going to ask you because I saw Ben Folks he actually talked to, you know, a scientist about what is going on. So it's interesting that you are looking to the experts to see what's possible. Mike, what's your perspective?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that just came out over the last 24 hours is Lehman Good was scheduled to fight on April 18th, and they try to move forward. He got the COVID-19 virus, and it's just first of all, before I even speculate, because I'm a little bit more optimistic because, and I've heard it from family members. I'm like, hey, I think I'm going to be traveling back to work sooner than later. They're like, yo, you're crazy. It's not going to happen. And then you see 3 states are starting to, you know, loosen up their restrictions this week and May 1st. So I think we live in a country that's very copycat flow. And once one state does it, the others are going to do it. People are going to travel to the states that are open to get their hair done and so on and so forth. And then you're going to start to see a sense of urgency from people who don't care and from people who want to do it their way. And I'm not here to crap on the UFC, but Dana White has always said, you know, you goofs doubting me. Like, why would you ever doubt me? I know this sport better than anyone else. I know what I'm doing. You guys need to trust me. So in that sense, I wouldn't put it past the UFC that we have a fight on May 9th. The card is ridiculous. Obviously, Amanda Nunes says she won't be on that card, fighting Felicia Spencer, which is fine because then there's a whole other – do you get another fantastic fight? Do you put possibly an interim title for the heavyweight division on the line with Francis Ngannou and Rosenstrike? They're supposed to fight. We don't know what's going on with the heavyweight. So they have so many options. The PR standpoint for me in my eyes with the UFC is we're going to put on the biggest, baddest card, as Dana White always likes to call them when they do happen, because no one else has anything to watch. We're going to be a live sport. And, you know, the old quote is if there's a football game, basketball game, I think baseball or soccer game, and a fight breaks out, everyone's going to go run towards the fight. So if we're giving people action and violence that we all crave in this society, and it's a sporting event with great fights, from the UFC side, it makes total sense. But I'm with Dan. I kind of really question what guidelines and safety precautions will be taken.
Yeah. Okay. There's a couple of things I want to bring up. First of all, you said everyone's going to run to a fight, and that's literally what we're going to do. Because I always bring this up in like one of the first classes. Do you guys know why the boxing place is called a ring? Do you know, Dan? Do you know, Mike?
I don't.
Anyone in my class want to chime in?
Because it used to be that everybody would just kind of circle around and it would be a ring of people and the fight would be in the middle.
We learned this. This is, you know, we're talking in the era when boxing, we're talking in the UK, when it was illegal, but illegal, and the police, the registrants would just look away. But thank you. That's Tessa from Austin. I appreciate. But it's funny that you bring that up. The other thing I want to bring up is New Jersey. I forgot to say this. You guys now are at 85,301 cases and 4,200 deaths. So it's very different looking at what you've been through, Mike, and you understand like where other states are not feeling that kind of thing. Now, Dan, will the Athletic, and I forgot to bring up Josh Gross as well, is on your team. Is he also do soccer and MMA? Yes. Will you send someone to the May 9th card?
No, I don't. I personally don't think it's safe, but it was kind of company policy anyway that we've suspended travel, and we kind of took that day by day. You know, where it was, you know, we've got obviously the company Slack channel, and we get daily updates from the top, which is super beneficial. But part of those updates are what's going on with individual sports, but then also how we're handling things. You know, we have offices in San Francisco, New York, and London. And it went from voluntary work from home to mandatory work from home. Travel went, just stuff that was previously booked, no new travel,
Mhm.
to now if you're on the road, get home immediately. And just day by day, we saw this. So we're not ready to travel yet. I actually just had a talk with our chief content officer a week or two ago, just, to make sure he and I were on the same page about that. But, we've done our homework. We talked to the epidemiologists and the scientists, and, not even looking at it from a journalism standpoint, but just, trying not to get our staff killed. We just don't think it would be smart at this point.
Oh my gosh. When you have to make these choices, bringing back Lyman Good, and do you guys have like 5 more? I know we're going past time because of my technical difficulties. Great. I just have this is stuff I'm like so excited to bring up. And again, class, please like raise your hand, or, because this is when we get to have the conversation with the experts. Lyman Good, he initially just said he had an injury. And I know you have privacy with health, but that makes me concerned because he had symptoms, right? What about asymptomatic fighters, who are not getting tested? I know they're going to test somewhere on the Fight Island or May 9th, but I do think that should be a red flag. And I think you brought that up, Mike. My other question here is, if this goes through, and you guys are kind of like, we're kind of skeptically optimistic, I guess is the best way to say. What do we think about other sports? Like, do you think, Dan, you worked in baseball. What do you see their projection on getting back? And are they doing it at a different speed than the UFC?
I think the difference is they're going to look at it from strictly kind of risk versus reward, like, and making sure that they don't set themselves up where, they could be in, there would be so much liability that it would just be stupid to go forward with the event. I think that's how the other sports are looking at it, kind of dollars and cents, risk versus reward. I mean, I hate to, like with the UFC, so much of it's just a pissing contest to prove that they can put on an event. And again, I know that it sounds maybe overly simplistic, but they got where they are kind of with the mentality, and I think they've gotten to the point where now they can graduate beyond that and look at the risk versus reward. If you put on an event and half the fighters end up testing positive, like that really could be the end of the organization in some sense. And I don't think they balance that risk versus reward like other sports were. Like if you just told me the UFC is going to come back, I'd be like, ugh. If you told me Major League Baseball is going to come back, I'd be like, oh, I wonder what got them to that decision and why they now feel comfortable. With the UFC, that very rarely factors into the decision.
In many ways, even though it's Strikeforce, but we're not in the Playboy Mansion anymore, right?
Yeah.
We graduated into the mainstream. I guess some other questions I have, and again, this is for my class to come in, with what's going on, the Professional Fighters League, which also has a contract with ESPN. They are a newer promotion that has actually a tournament style. It has a league where people get points, and then they eventually, there's this $1 million prize. They just canceled. And Dan, and then Mike too, I would very curious. They don't really need live gates anyway. I went to a PFL here in DC. I had cage side $50. So I don't think they were making much on that. So it was a great event. So why did they cancel?
I think it was probably a combination of things. I think, we don't know the exact details of where their investor money's coming from, but I assume they had a long enough runway to get them through that. It's funny, Ben Folks just filed a story where he talked to the CEO about the decision. I obviously haven't had a chance to read it.
Oh,
cool. So I have the answers in front of me.
You guys
but I think,
right after this, and you all have
but I think part of it too is just they're kind of unique in that format. Like you said, they do $1 million tournaments. It's points. It's not like UFC where when you've got enough fights, you can just throw an event out there. If you do like half a tournament and then you have to delay it because things get really bad, what do you do with that $1 million prize? And do you want to leave the fighters hanging? I think especially, like you said, not being super dependent on gate and stuff too, and assuming they have the runway, the investor money to hold them over till next year, it probably was the prudent decision just to kind of scrap it and start when they know that, you know, they're not going to have interruptions.
Got it. And so unlike, this is the other thing with the UFC, and Michael, I'll maybe point this question to you. Everyone we see this, and you actually even hear sometimes Dana slip, like Ari wants me to do this, who's the CEO of Endeavor. They really need that ESPN money, correct? Because the entire company of Endeavor is an entertainment-based institution where that's where they're getting their funding. So I could see also that the PFL, they're not going to make those ESPN contracts either, but they just don't get that. They have the investor money. They'll just wait till next year. They'll even give stipends to the fighters. What do you think about that, Mike? What do you think about this need to get these fights on? 42 fights and for the rest of the year. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, when I saw that on the flip side of things, you know, a couple things came to mind is obviously I like to hear that the fighters are getting paid, but the roster is a lot smaller than the UFC's. So that's one thing. The other thing is obviously it opens up a schedule now. I do envision a 2020 where we may have Dana White Contender Series fights turn into ESPN events where we will see fights on Friday and Saturday. Because, you know, like you said, both the UFC and ESPN, they need this deal to work out for this year. The other flip side of it is, and it'd be interesting, I'm sure the great team over at The Athletic would have an easier time tracking the story down than I would, but what's a guy like Rory McDonald think of all this? He's a guy who just left Bellator, and now his first season with the PFL is suspended, and it's just like, you know, I think a lot of people would completely understand if he's like, I'm cool with it, especially with a stipend coming in. But I know that the UFC contracted fighters that I've talked to, it's literally been every single fighter that I've spoken to has said the same thing. We're not professional football players. We're not professional basketball or baseball, or we have all these things that we need to pay for, and we need to compete in order to get paid. And, you know, it's not like you have 60 million guaranteed in your contract, so you're good, or you have this sponsor and you're good. You know, it's just different. So, you know, I would say for less than 1% of the UFC, they're okay without fighting for a while. But 99% of the UFC, and maybe, you know, you could pick out a better number, but majority of the UFC needs to fight. And the UFC needs them to fight, and ESPN needs that deal to come through. So.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. Again, I like having something to pay attention to log on to The Athletic for, or, you know, to one of your sites that you work at, Mike. Because
one of the 9,000.
Yeah, it's one of the advanced sites, because it's like, well, it's something, you know, even though, you know, I am also on the hand, like, I want it to be safe. I do not want the sport that I love to be tarnished and to kind of, you know, do anything that could harm it. I guess lastly, because again, anyone have any questions? We've gotten through. I've looked at my list here. Oh, Atticus, please.
Dan, you mentioned that you kind of got to like build your team at The Athletic. What did you like already have people in mind? Like was that something you were thinking about before, or kind of like what made you pick the people you did?
Yeah, the MMA Junkie, one of the hires that I was most kind of happy to get was a guy named Matt Erickson, who is kind of underrated in our space, but I liked him because I knew he could write a little, he could edit well, he knew photography, he knew video, he was kind of a jack of all trades. At The Athletic, I knew it was going to be kind of strictly about writing, so it really was kind of going after the best writers. And Ben Folks, a guy I worked with at MMA Junkie, he was number one on my list. I love his writing style. Like, I feel like it's a treat to get to read his stuff before anybody else gets to. But we kind of put together a team. Josh Gross, kind of the OG of MMA media. He really knows how to handle regulatory issues and legal stuff. A guy like Sean Al-Shati or Chuck Mendenhall, they just have such a way with words. So, not many websites get the kind of the benefit of just hiring straight writers and just working in the sport as long as I did. It's like, okay, I know who I think are the best writers and who I think, their audience would follow them to a subscription site like this. So, no, I think, any industry that you work in, if you go into writing or editing, you're always going to have in the back of your mind kind of your list of 5 or 10 writers where, in a perfect world, these are people I'd want to work with. And amazingly, I actually got that opportunity. So
That's a great question, Atticus. You got to cherry pick my favorite writers. So
yeah.
That's great. I would love to have that position. Oh, Gabby.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Dan.
Hey.
You guys are so awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. I just want to ask, since you guys been working at MMA for quite a while, who's your favorite fighters?
Good question.
I think I'm still partial to Rich Franklin just because he kind of was my ticket in, but he's been like so gracious and nice with his time. But like I really enjoy kind of, it's hard for us to root for fighters as a fan. I think you start to appreciate guys who give you a good interview or are exceptionally thoughtful. I think you guys probably know Julie Kedzie either through the class or stuff. Like, a lot of times, even if we're just kind of doing a story and we don't even quote her directly, she's like, when we were doing the fighter survey, this half-hour thing, she was one of our guinea pigs just because we know we can trust her feedback. She feels comfortable with us. She's kind of smarter, but like a Paul Felder, a Daniel Cormier, guys who actually went on to become commentators. I think there's a reason that they became commentators is they are thoughtful like that. So I know I'm rambling on, but I think when you're kind of in media and stuff like that, your idea of favorite fighter or favorite athlete changes a bit. You use different criteria because you want people who are going to give you a good interview. You want to talk to someone when you ask them a question, they're not going to have a rehearsed answer. They're really going to put some thought into it. And one of the best things you hear kind of when you're on the other side of it is, if they take the time to be like, oh, that was a really good question. Like you get that sense of pride, especially if it's someone who's done a million interviews and they still think you have a good question. So anyone who's told me I've done an interview is instantly my favorite fighter. So.
My class is going to get to meet Julie Kedzie. Her and Fernanda are coming. We're doing a media and gender kind of panel. So I agree with you on that one. Mike.
So I have a different answer, but kind of a weird one as well. So definitely very partial to the guy who got me into the sport, which would be McGregor. I had the chance to meet him. I think now it's 2 years ago or a year ago. It was a year ago. Last St. Patrick's Day in Chicago, which was wild. It turned into a whole media thing for me as well. But kind of to echo what Dan's saying, I've actually found my favorite interviews and people to talk to are either those in the media, like on the broadcast. I have a good rapport with like a John Anik. I had a real good rapport with Brendan Fitzgerald. But coaches, I think one of my frequently most listened to podcasts are me and Dean Thomas. And kind of going back to what Dan said, Dean will come on the show and be like, hey man, I'm offended you haven't called me in a month. And it's like, whoa, like I'm still trying to cement myself in this sport. Like that's crazy to me, and there's a whole backstory of how I got to go train an American top team with Dean because something that was said on the radio show and he pulled it out of me. But my biggest advice would not be, obviously if you have favorite fighters, I wouldn't openly root for them if you're trying to get into the media side of things, but let their reasoning of why you like them kind of be your fuel, because that's what was my fuel. Because when I saw the story of Conor McGregor, I was like, wait, this guy was collecting welfare and was a plumber, and now he's making $100 million to box Floyd Mayweather. It's crazy. And, I have a lot lesser fighters that I not that they're lesser, but they haven't made the money in their career like a Conor McGregor has, but their stories are so much more interesting that almost every fighter, PFL, Bellator, UFC, they all have a reason that they're fighting. So I would just encourage you guys to find out whose stories kind of circle in with you and make you want to be in the sport more. And those should be your favorite fighters or your favorite coaches. For me, it's who makes me laugh, who actually responds all the time. I do a thing, I really do a thing where I contact pretty much everyone I've interviewed, everyone in my phone, at least once a month. I'll pick a random day and I'll just reach out to them. And it turns into conversations and relationships that grow, that we have conversations off the record. So I wouldn't necessarily say like, I have this fighter, I have that fighter, so on and so forth. There are a lot of people I love to watch, but I get more excited, and this is a key, and I don't know how Dan feels about this. I get excited watching fights. If I go into this May 9th, if it happens, I'll go into this May 9th card with a list of fighters. The list really should be all of them, but specific fighters who I want to talk to after the event. And it makes me that much more invested on fight night, because if they win, as Dan could speak to, they will definitely want to talk after a win. Not many fighters want to talk after a loss, but then the ones that do, that just adds an element to their story. So find out whose story you can relate to and whose story you'd like to tell. Because for me, I left professional mainstream sports to get into MMA because I wanted to become storytellers like you see at The Athletic and some of the other big outlets.
Well said. That's why I think I am so compelled by combat sports, is that, the boxer or the fighter, it represents you. Like, and when they're in that ring, we've gotten fortunate to meet Angela Hill, who has an interesting backstory, and that is something compelling about fighters, because unlike teams, you don't really get to know them as well. Well, great. Okay, my last question is, unless there's anyone else, because we've taken enough of your time, so thank you, with daughter interruptions and sound, so I really appreciate it. Okay, my last question is, because we don't have sports right now, at this moment right now, is there something, we've been doing combat sports, a movie, a fight, a piece of literature, an article that you would recommend that we take the time now to read? So I don't know who wants to go first. Mike, are you ready?
Yeah, I can. So, I would just encourage the class to dive in on anything and everything. My favorite documentary is, or was, I guess still is The Fight Game. Or excuse me, not The Fight Game, The Hurt Business. The Hurt Business, it's dark. It is very, very dark. But I think it brings a sense of realism into what this sport has an after effect on. After that documentary, I had a chance to interview not only the director, but Gary Goodridge, and I was nervous. And then you guys can go back and look at who Gary Goodridge is, and he's such a pioneer in combat sports. But I'm talking to a guy with CTE and serious depression, and he's open about it. And there were times in the interview where I was like, oh my God, I wanted to keep it going, but I didn't want him to feel like he was having his own bad moments during the interview. So I wanted to keep it upbeat, uplifting. So definitely The Hurt Business, because I think it brings a very real, raw side of what the sport does to its fighters. I suggested to you, I'm not sure if you saw it yet, but the Ronda Rousey story. I know she's like everyone's most hated person right now in combat sports, but Through My Father's Eyes is a great documentary just added to Netflix. Obviously, the Conor McGregor documentary, Notorious, also on Netflix. But I've gone back and I've just watched fights. Like, what were some of my favorite events? And I do that because I want to know what was the broadcast team saying about these fights and these fighters leading into it, and where have they grown? And maybe there's someone I forgot about that's still around that I want to talk to. So just kind of, if there's anything where you're like, that's one of my favorite events, go back and watch it because it may spark you.
Yeah, thank you. Dan, do you have any offerings during this time?
For me, kind of the weird thing about MMA, and 15 years later, I still haven't fully figured it out, is I think the appeal for me with MMA is, why would any sane person get in a cage and fight another person? And honestly, I think for like 15 years of doing this job, it's been trying to get at that answer. And obviously there's a lot of answers, but like, even if I could fight like these guys, I don't think I would have the bravery to go in there, or especially, you know, when 2/3 of them know that they're sacrificing brain health and still want to do it. Like, that would be even one more deterrent for me not to go in there. So for me, I enjoy reading stuff, watching stuff. If it kind of gets at the root of that question, like why would you do this when there are other options to make money and stuff? And for me, there's a really old documentary called The Smashing Machine, a very early MMA fighter, Mark Kerr. It kind of started to get at the base of that. And then there's one with Dustin Poirier, Fightville. It's a little older now. It's really kind of the early part of his career. I like those because it kind of gets at the root of it, and that there's no easy answer to why these guys do this. A lot of times it's the kind of only thing that they were good at, and they realized it could get them out of poverty. Some guys like Rich Franklin, who had his bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Cincinnati, you know, mathematics, a smart guy, could have had a good job. Why would he do something like this? You know, it's not like he's pulling himself out of poverty or he had no other options. So that kind of stuff really interests me. And honestly, I think the best way to kind of learn that, especially if you haven't been following the sport for 15 years, is to go back and watch the first season of The Ultimate Fighter, because you see 16 of those stories coming together. And I think that's why kind of The Ultimate Fighter really sparked my desire to want to work in this industry, or to even try to, was you realize there's so many, like, these guys are so different for the why they're doing this. And the more you understand the different reasons that people do it, the better you can cover the sport.
Oh, those are great options. Thank you. You know, you guys, we have a lot that came out of here. We got to go read Ben Folk's article on The Athletic. We've got these movies. We got, you know, old fights to catch up to. But I really want to thank you guys. Thank you for coming to class today, Dan Stupp and Mike Pendelton. Please, you know, I think we don't even need to highlight where you can be found, and because we've really demonstrated. Thank you for sharing your stories. You know, we're always getting advice here too on the persistence needed. You know, maybe find that perfect timing there, and or go back and go, you know, do an article on a track meet. And or high school, you know, football players, and if you move to Philadelphia and they take back your job, it's okay. You'll get through it, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, Megan Hoffman is saying thank you in the chat room. But please come back. Always be friends with Writing and Fighting, and we'll hang in there together. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.